During the reign of Queen Victoria, Leamington Spa had been transformed from a small health resort into a thriving modern town. When she died in 1901, the town faced an uncertain future. Powerful social forces were beginning to stir, and Britain would soon be embroiled in the so-called war to end all wars.
The story of the Leamington and Warwick Tramway starts in the latter years of Victoria's reign. By the 1870s, the population of Leamington had reached 23,000 and that of adjoining Warwick 12,000.
Employment was on the increase and tourism was also on the increase, and the railway systems were supporting that by running excursions to both of the towns, highlighting the benefits and the beauties of the area.
Construction of the first Leamington and Warwick Tramway began in November 1881.
It went out to tender, and I think there was something in the order of 13 tenders. John Fell, who hadn't actually built any tram systems, was successful in the tender of £14,600, I think it was, give or take a couple of £100.
The route started near the Manor House Hotel in Avenue Road, joining the parade by the parish church, passing the pump rooms and Regent Hotel before taking a left turn into Warwick Street and from there along the Emscott Road towards Warwick.
But there was a problem. The tracks had been laid through the archway of Warwick's East Gate. When the Board of Trade Inspector came to conduct his final checks before the new tramway was due to open, he discovered that there wasn't enough room for a tram loaded with passengers to get through.
It meant that all the people on the top deck had to come off, go through, and then get back on the tram to go down Smith Street or go up into Jury Street and High Street. And I just think that's incredible that they got that far without realising that there was a major issue. And thankfully, the inspector suggested that could that the service could start on the proviso that they all detrained, as they say, and then got back on.
By the early 1900s, electricity was starting to replace horsepower on tramways across the country, and a campaign to electrify the Leamington and Warwick Tramway began to gather momentum.
Essentially, it was down to halving the cost. It was said that the horse-drawn system was labour-intensive and perhaps not as reliable as they would have wished.
Electrification went ahead and the new service started in July 1905. At its height, the service carried over 2 million passengers a year, but by 1914, the tracks were in a poor state of repair. In 1916, a runaway tram crashed into the corner of a Warwick pub.
The driver, Walter Mumford, got off the tram. It's not clear whether he went for a call of nature or whether he went to get a drink. The conductress, Miss Haskins, heard what she thought was the bell. So she released the brake. That part of the track system is on a gradient that takes it down. There's no driver, and the tram is increasing in speed. It gets to the point of a curve at Eastgate. At such a speed, it leaves the track and embeds itself into the front wall of the Castle Arms public house.
The post-war economy couldn't support the level of investment required to renovate the run-down tramway, and the growth of buses and motor cars in the 1920s reduced passenger demand. The final Leamington tram ran on the 16th of August, 1930.
On the day that they ran, there was hardly anybody on the last service. And within days of that service running, the contractors were in and lifting the track.
The campaign for women's suffrage began to gather momentum in the early 1900s. Although some had the right to vote in local elections, women, and many working-class men, had no say in choosing their members of parliament in general elections. The cause attracted many of Leamington's most prominent women of the day, including Ada Sharland Wackrill, the daughter of Leamington's first mayor.
It was in the year her father Samuel died in 1907 that Ada sort of really took up, in a sense, her father's political mantle by joining the Votes of Women cause and so campaigning for greater equality. Ada was also among several women from different suffrage societies in Leamington that travelled by train down to London in 1911 to take part in the women's coronation procession, a really spectacular march organised by the suffrage campaigners to rival the King's formal coronation procession from which women were excluded.
Another important figure in the suffrage movement was Mary Dormer Harris.
Mary Dormer Harris was a founder member of the Leamington and Warwick group, the National Suffrage Society, which was a moderate society affiliated to the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies led by Millicent Fawcett. She's one of the first female university lecturers in the country, so she's a real pioneer.
There was a real sort of mixed bag of belonging in Leamington in terms of suffrage society support, but the law-abiding National Union appears to have been the most popular, which really reflects the national picture.
Although the Leamington movement was overwhelmingly peaceful, many were quietly sympathetic to the hardline suffragettes led by Emmeline Pankhurst, and Mrs. Pankhurst was invited to visit the town on several occasions.
The same demand is everywhere being made by women. The removal of sex disability. For to be shut out altogether because of an accident of birth is a most grievous injustice. It is no use expecting to get this great reform by methods different from those adopted by unenfranchised people in any part of the world. They have been forced, sooner or later, to resort to unconstitutional means in order to get inside the Constitution. The secret of politics is to go to the people who can give you what you want and give them no peace until you get it.
The women of Leamington seemed reluctant to take up this call to arms.
If the message broke through at all in Leamington, it saw what the press described as a harebrained scheme in 1913 where suffragettes attempted to destroy the contents of 2 pillar boxes and set fire to the General Post Office itself. The perpetrators were never identified.
In April 1911, the government conducted its decennial census survey to gather household and population information. This became the focus for a national protest by the suffrage movement.
Women boycotted the census in various ways. They either evaded it by absenting themselves from home altogether on census night so they could not be counted. Some organised mass evasions, or what we might call suffragette sleepovers, at secret locations where they sort of sang songs and had a jolly old time while hiding out from census officials. Others resisted the census, remaining at home but refusing to fill in the required details, and sometimes sort of scrawling graffitied messages of defiance across the census returns, such as "No vote, no census." A law-abiding suffragist from Leamington, Ada Florence Whittick, gave all the correct details on her census form but added at the bottom a warning, "Non-militant at present," revealing her temptation, born of frustration, that she was really seriously thinking about taking up militant tactics.
After war was declared in July 1914, there was an enthusiastic rush to enlist, both amongst those young men itching to fight at the front and older men keen to serve at home as reservists and volunteers.
Make no mistake about it, our country is in peril. It is the duty of every man who is able to enlist, not for home service, but for active service abroad. It is his duty, not only to his country and family, but to his God.
As men headed off to war, the town's women took over the work of supporting the war effort.
Women were working on the railways, they were working in factories, carrying out a number of the jobs that would ordinarily have been carried out by the menfolk.
When war broke out in August 1914, all of the suffrage societies in Leamington and Warwickshire almost immediately laid down their sort of tools, if you like, and said that they would start to work towards the war effort.
As casualties started to return from the front, Leamington also played its part in helping the wounded.
The Red Cross and the St John's Ambulance Brigade began efforts to persuade local units of what were known as the voluntary aid detachments to set up additional auxiliary hospitals. These were normally in large private premises that were taken over or donated for the purpose. And in Leamington, 2 were developed, one at the Warren on Lillington Road and one not far from where I'm sitting at Holmdene on New Warwick Road.
Regular fundraising events took place in town to help support these hospitals, and many of the town's young women volunteered to serve there as nurses.
One Leamingtonian who rose to prominence in the war was Henry Tandy. He participated in many of the key moments of the Allied campaign on the Western Front, and his many acts of heroism led to him becoming the most decorated private in the entire British Army. Henry was born in very humble circumstances in Kenilworth Street in 1891. When he left school, he got a dead-end job working in the boiler room of the Regent Hotel. In 1910, he decided to join the army.
He enlisted during a period of peace, of course, and into the regular army, which meant you had to commit for 12 years. It was the guarantee of a solid earning, and that you'd be fed and given uniform to wear and what have you, which for many men was several notches above the realities of their day-to-day existence at that time.
Henry was one of the first local men to be deployed to the Western Front. In October 1914, at the First Battle of Ypres, he performed his first notable act of heroism, rescuing a wounded colleague at the Menin Road crossroads. This became an iconic moment in the early part of the war, immortalised in a painting by the Italian war artist Fortunino Matania. Henry himself did not come through the war unscathed.
If you're out there infrequently over 4 years, you're going to get hit. It's almost as straightforward as that. And Henry Tandy was hit twice, the first time being in the epic First Battle of Ypres in the October of 1914, the first very large-scale engagement in which his own battalion participated.
In the space of a few extraordinary weeks in the summer of 1918, Henry's actions earned him the nation's highest military honours, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the Military Medal and the Victoria Cross.
From early August until the armistice of the 11th of November, 5 British armies in France and Flanders were engaged in a series of gigantic climactic battles.
On the 28th of August, during the Second Battle of Cambrai, he took 2 men, dashed across no man's land under fire and captured a trench. He returned with 20 German prisoners. On the 12th of September, he led another bombing party into German trenches, returning with yet more prisoners. On the 28th of September, during the capture of a canal crossing at Marcoing, Henry led a bayonet charge, fighting so fiercely that 37 of the enemy were driven into the hands of the remainder of his company. Although twice wounded, Henry refused to leave the battlefield until the fight was won.
For Henry himself to be awarded 3 of Britain's highest military honours in such a short period is truly extraordinary. He was not only among the very few men that earned a large number of high-end gallantry and bravery awards, but he did so in a very concerted, short period of time.
The Russell family lived in a small terraced house in Albion Row, down by the canal in one of the poorest parts of town. The 2 eldest boys, William and George, had a reputation as local troublemakers. With few prospects at home, they were happy to enlist for military service. When war began, they were joined at the front by their younger brother Frederick, a former choir boy at St. John's Church, who had to bring forward his wedding so that he could be married before meeting up with his regiment and heading off to France. An article in the Courier entitled "Mother's Busy Day" celebrated this family's contribution to the war effort. In December 1914, the 1st Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment came under heavy bombardment at Saint-Yvon, where William and George were fighting almost side by side. A German shell exploded above the British trenches, wounding William and killing George outright.
The area in which this clash occurred is east of a large wood called Loft Wood. The British called it Plug Street. In October and November 1914, it was hell on earth. And the battle went on for quite a period of time, with the Warwicks being heavily engaged. So the two brothers find themselves in a very intense piece of fighting.
William soon returned to the front line and was awarded a medal for his bravery. But he too was dead soon after, shot in the head by a sniper in March 1915.
During that winter and into the spring of 1915, when casualties were incurred, it was likely to be either by occasional shell fire or, more likely, by snipers, positioned to observe, watch carefully for any movement and pick men off when they could. Now, the battalion's war diary in that day in 1915 reports 8 casualties on the day, all from sniper fire.
Just 2 months later, Frederick was also killed in action. The effect on the family must have been devastating, not least to their youngest son, Ernest, who was just 14 at the start of the war and had watched 3 older brothers go off to war never to return. Ernest turned 18 in the final months of the war, and he too would soon be thrown into the heat of battle.
Men would be deemed to have enlisted on their 18th birthday. You weren't going to avoid it. You just had to take it on the chin and do what you were told. But in the context where his family had already suffered a great deal, it must have been with great trepidation for his parents in particular. Ernest himself, of course, we don't know. They've had good training, lengthy training at home, but you're thrown into a situation where casualty rates are high, and unfortunately he's killed in a fairly short period of time after arrival.
It has been the sad lot of Mrs. W.T. Russell of 2 Albion Row, Leamington, to have to drain the cup of sorrow to the very dregs. She has been officially informed that her youngest son, Private Ernest Russell of the Hampshire Regiment, was killed in action in France on September the 12th, so that she has now lost all her 4 sons to the war. Her husband died on April the 27th, and in May 1917, her daughter died from the shock of hearing that her fiancé had been killed in action. The sorrows of such mothers as Mrs. Russell should make all Englishmen and women resolve before God that the brave lads who have given their lives shall not have died in vain.
Whilst Henry Tandy's story was exceptional, that of the Russells was all too common. In all, a total of 570 Leamington men, including 45 sets of brothers, were killed in action. Almost every part of town was heavily affected. Parish records and monuments in churches around the town commemorate those who died, and a war memorial featuring a sculpture by Albert Toft was unveiled in Euston Place in May 1922.
With proud thanksgiving, a mother for her children, England mourns for her dead across the sea. Flesh of her flesh they were, spirit of her spirit, fallen in the cause of the free. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
The period immediately after the war was a time of social and economic uncertainty and political upheaval. In a bid to boost the local economy and create new job opportunities, Leamington Borough Council offered incentives to employers willing to come to the town.
As well as building new housing for people after the war, Leamington Borough Council was anxious to bring new employment into the area. And they managed by giving a grant to a company called Henry Griffiths, who were in the jewellery quarter of Birmingham, and that's evolved into a factory being built. A brilliant employer. They provided sports facilities for their employees. They had bowling greens at the front, I believe, and they had a field at the side where they could play football and cricket.
In recognition of their contribution to the war effort, all men and some women were granted the right to vote in parliamentary elections through the 1918 Representation of the People Act.
The government realised that all the young men fighting on the Western Front in France would come back and not have the vote. So they started to think about introducing universal male suffrage, which would give the vote to all men over the age of 21.
It near trebled the franchise in the country from 7 million to 21 million. And it really sort of heralded the demise of the Liberal Party as a kind of major opposition party to the Conservatives, and the rise of the Labour Party as the second party of British politics.
Leamington became an important venue for the organised labour movement. On the 27th of September 1921, 140 delegates from trade unions around the country assembled at Leamington Town Hall to complete their amalgamation as the Transport and General Workers Union.
This was the final part of the process of bringing together all of these different trade unions, which together accounted for over 300,000 members. So this was a huge organisation. And what they had to do at Leamington was agree on the rules that would govern their new union.
During the 3-day meeting, unemployed people from across the district gathered at the bright obelisk outside the town hall.
The demonstration outside the bright obelisk was one of many that happened during this period. And it was really a kind of protest and a sort of simmering frustration, anger, I think, on the part of working people who were unemployed. There was about 700 people unemployed in Leamington at the time, which was quite a significant proportion of the working adults in the town. And what they were really asking for was assistance from local government. So the poor relief that was offered by the Warwick Board of Guardians was deemed insufficient to live on. There were soup kitchens that people didn't want to rely on, you know, this kind of meagre charitable handout.
In the 1923 general election, Daisy Greville, the Countess of Warwick, stood as an independent Labour candidate in the parliamentary seat of Warwick and Leamington.
The Countess of Warwick was a socialite who'd undergone a kind of conversion to socialism in the late 19th century. And she'd undertaken many sort of practical endeavours to this end. She founded Studley College in Warwickshire, which trained women for agricultural work, which was radical then, and I would suggest quite radical now. Still, she was quite an unusual choice. She was still very much an aristocrat, and of course she was a woman, and she was one of the very first women to stand for general election, and absolutely the first in Warwick and Leamington.
Because this is the first election where women can vote, she wants to bring women together. But she really stands on a pretty standard Labour Party ticket.
The voters weren't impressed though. They pulled her in last, and the election was won by a 26-year-old Conservative politician called Anthony Eden, and he would of course occupy that seat for the next 3 decades and go on to be Prime Minister.
The 1919 Housing Act gave local authorities the ability to build council houses funded by the General Rate Fund. These would be rented to working class tenants at affordable prices.
The problem with getting them built was there was a distinct lack of building materials following the First World War, and there was also a distinct lack of skilled craftsmen, artisans as they called them, to do the building and electricity. And so they were a little bit slow off the mark. Leamington started building their first 2 estates in 1919, Claremont Field and Leicester Street.
These 180 homes were the first tentative steps towards affordable housing for all.
The people who came to live in the places were the people who were possibly living in very poor conditions in the rest of the town. There were people living in damp basements, 2 rooms in over shops or houses where they were sharing accommodation or lodging houses. So it was their first chance to get a proper home.
Soon after, the council put forward proposals for the building of a further 260 houses on Rushmore Farm, next to the railway line in the south of the town.
They were invited to go and visit Leicester, and have a look at some houses there designed by Arthur Wakeley. And they were unusual in the fact that the pitched roof went from side to side instead of from front to back. The idea was that each one would only cost about £300 to build.
These homes offered a vast improvement in living standards for those lucky enough to move into them. However, there were still many people living in appalling conditions in slum dwellings behind the parade and near the railway line.
The churches in Leamington were very concerned that the council weren't building council houses quick enough. And so two valiant people, Mr and Mrs Salt from Leamington, decided to set up a company called the Leamington Slum Clearance Company. You might call it a housing association these days. They decided they were going to try and collect money to build houses for people who were living in the slums of Leamington. And they were going to do it by public subscription. If you look back at old Leamington couriers of the time, every week on the front page there'd be a little advert saying Leamington Slum Clearance Company Leamington, a list of everybody who donated money to the project.
On May the 6th, 1927, the Bishop of Coventry laid the foundation stone for the first houses built in what was known as the Holt estate. 18 houses were built at a rent of 10 shillings a week, about 15% less than council rents. The new tenants were families whose previous homes had been declared unfit for human habitation and would be demolished once vacant. A key figure in the development of Leamington in the early part of the 20th century was Alderman Alfred Holt, who was the son of a wealthy London brewery owner. He trained as a barrister, but lived the life of a gentleman at leisure.
He came to Leamington, I think, more or less by chance, and he obviously caught it on a particularly good day because the band was playing in Pump Room Gardens. He loved that. He loved the wide streets. So he was immediately smitten by it and returned and took a lease on the house within a few months.
A keen sportsman and aspiring politician, Holt quickly immersed himself in the life of the town.
By 1907, he was the mayor of Leamington. 1909, he was an alderman, which is a senior councillor, and he went on to become mayor of the town 7 times eventually.
Holt was heavily involved in the development of the town's parks and gardens, often bankrolling improvements from his own pocket. He paid for exotic trees to be imported into Jeffson Gardens, funded the construction of a new bandstand, and the installation of fountains in the lake. He was inspired by his extensive travels in Europe and felt passionately that Leamington should have its own public art gallery. As mayor, he championed the construction of an extension to the public library specifically for this purpose.
The fact that it was feasible to build an art gallery and have something to display was largely down to Holt himself. He was actively buying among contemporary artists, specifically to donate directly to the art gallery. So it's an act of great generosity on his part. He donated a total of 109 pictures to the collection, which is, I think, even to this day, the largest single donation of works by any individual.
Elsewhere in the town, an announcement in the Leamington Courier led to the creation of the Leamington and Warwick Operatic Society, still going strong 100 years later as the Leamington and Warwick Musical Society.
Actually, there were 2 pieces, and one said that because of the proliferation of societies countrywide, that people were thinking Leamington should have one. And then in the same paper on a different page was the actual notice for the first meeting, which was taken by Mr. Charles Watson Mill, who owned the Theatre Royal in Regent Grove, and a Mr. Frederick Eccles, who became the first musical director. So that meeting took place on Saturday, the 7th of May 1921, and the society was formed.
7 months later, the society staged its first production, Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado.
Crowded houses on Saturday witnessed the final performances of The Mikado by the Leamington and Warwick Operatic Society. The outbursts of applause, as hearty as it was well-deserved, marked the progress of the opera to an enthusiastic finish.
The week went really well, successful production from the artistic point of view, but financially they were a little bit short. They started the week with £24 taken at the box office, and they needed £30 to pay the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company the royalties. They supposedly went round the streets of Leamington, cap in hand, singing "We Have Seen Better Days," begging people to put money in their hat. But they also ran social evenings and so they raised the money. And in December 1922, they produced The Gondoliers, which played to 4,675 people. And 98 years later, The Gondoliers is still in the top 10 of Leamington and Warwick audience figures, which is quite amazing, really.
In May 1922, another meeting was convened, this time at the home of the Reverend William and Wilna Constable.
So these two people invited to their home a number of like-minded people, and 18 of them assembled at their home in Woodcote Road in Warwick to discuss the possibility of starting a drama club. And during the evening, they agreed to do this, and they named it the Warwick and Leamington Dramatic Study Club, which I think over time got changed and switched to the Leamington and Warwick Dramatic Study Club.
The club staged its first production in March 1923, a version of John Goldsworthy's The Silver Box.
Most of the people who were in the cast were those officers and committee members from that first meeting. And it was performed just for one performance only, a private performance, at the Spencer Street Congregational School Hall.
Several members of the cast stood out, especially prominent by reason of the excellence of their work. The Reverend Wilna L. Constable, as the long-suffering Mrs. Jones, undertook with great success a very exacting part. Mr. W. A. Constable, the director of the club, undertook with distinct success the difficult role of Jack Barthwick, and Miss Dormer Harris, as the wife of John Barthwick MP, was equally well cast, investing the role with the comedy that the author had designed.
In the early days, the company used various venues around Leamington, including the Town Hall and Jeffson Gardens.
By 1932, they began to look for their own premises for the first time, and they landed on 58A Bedford Street. And this was a stable that was used by a company called Andrews Furnishers. And above it, it had a hayloft. So the company moved upstairs there, and the nickname of the loft started and stuck.
Institutions like the Loft Theatre, the Musical Society, and the Leamington Art Gallery and Museum, just like the homes created by the Borough Council and the Slum Clearance Company, are a lasting legacy of this dynamic and tumultuous period of the town's history. But it was the people of Leamington, both celebrated and unheralded, who played a central role in the national movements and global events which shape the world we live in today. We will remember them.